This castle was not a dream. It was a mistake, not because it collapsed, not because it failed to impress, but because once it began, it could not be stopped, only abandoned. And abandonment, in structures like this, is never neutral. It leaves a residue, a pressure, a bill that keeps running long after everyone walks away. The problem was never the size of the castle. The problem was what it demanded in return. Long before anyone spoke of romance or tragedy, Hart Island became a machine that consumed decisions. Every stone placed there required another stone. Every promise required reinforcement. And every delay multiplied the cost in ways no ledger could fully record. The castle didn't ask whether it should exist. It only asked how far its builders were willing to go once the first irreversible choice had been made. This is where the danger begins. Because once construction reached a certain point, stopping no longer meant saving money or effort. Stopping meant loss. And loss, at this scale, has a strange gravity. It pulls people into denial. It convinces them to continue even when the original reason has already disappeared. What kind of structure keeps demanding loyalty even after its purpose is gone? Hart Island was never meant to be a home in the ordinary sense. Homes adapt. They forgive. This place did neither. It was designed to impose order, symmetry, permanence. Every corridor assumed continuity. Every tower assumed a future audience. The castle was not asking to be lived in. It was asking to be completed. And completion was the real trap. Hundreds of hands worked in coordinated silence, repeating motions day after day, shaping stone that would outlast them. Their labor was not measured in hours, but in endurance. Each week cost more than most families could earn in a year, but no one spoke of that aloud. Talking about cost would have meant acknowledging the possibility of stopping, and stopping was no longer part of the plan. Yet even as the walls rose, something subtle began to fracture. The castle depended on a single assumption, that the future would arrive exactly as imagined, that nothing essential would change before the final stone was set, that the reason for building would remain intact long enough for the structure to justify itself. But systems built on a single emotional premise are fragile. When the message finally arrived, it did not explain, it did not justify, it did not soften the blow, it simply ordered absence. Tools were left where they fell. Work was not paused, it was erased. The silence that followed was not peaceful, it was structural. Like a bridge cut in mid-span, the castle was left holding weight. It was never designed to carry alone. And here is the uncomfortable question no one on the island could answer at the time. Once a monument absorbs so much effort, does it still belong to the person who ordered it? Or does it begin to own them instead? The workers left. The machines cooled, but the castle remained alert. Incomplete structures do not sleep. They wait. Exposed beams invite decay. Open rooms invite intrusion. And every season without resolution turns neglect into damage. This was no longer a construction site. It was a suspended obligation. From the river, the silhouette still projected confidence. Towers stood. Arches held. To an outsider, it looked almost finished. But proximity revealed the truth. Nothing inside was stable. Staircases led nowhere. Walls protected rooms that had never been defined. The building had form without function, a body without consensus. And that raised a second question, even more dangerous than the first. If the castle could no longer serve its original purpose, what would it become instead? Because power structures do not disappear when abandoned. They transform. They attract new meanings, new uses, new forms of decay. And every year it stood unfinished. The cost shifted, from money to memory, from effort to consequence. The mistake was not stopping the construction. The mistake was believing that stopping would end the story. Abandonment did not arrive all at once. It seeped in. At first, nothing looked different from a distance. The river kept moving. The island kept its outline. The castle's towers still cut the sky with the same confidence they had the day the tools fell silent. But inside the structure, time immediately began renegotiating ownership. Unfinished buildings age faster than completed ones. Not because they are weaker, but because they are exposed in the wrong places. Stone without ceiling absorbs moisture. Wood without walls absorbs rot. Iron without purpose attracts corrosion. Every material inside the castle assumed it would soon be protected by the next phase. That phase never came, and the system noticed. Rain entered where windows were meant to be. Winter expanded cracks that summer had softened. Each freeze widened the gaps by a fraction too small to notice until they multiplied. Within a few seasons, damage no one had planned for became damage no one could reverse cheaply. This is the part of the story often skipped. Decay is not dramatic at first. It is administrative. It shows up as small decisions deferred, as inspections never scheduled, as maintenance budgets never created, because no one agrees who should pay them. The castle had crossed an invisible line. It was no longer a project, but it was not yet a ruin. And that middle state is the most dangerous of all, because it creates ambiguity. Was this a property waiting for return, or a relic already belonging to the past? Without an answer, responsibility dissolved. Guards were unnecessary if the owner never came back. Repairs were pointless if completion was impossible. And so, the castle entered a vacuum, one where time was the only authority still enforcing rule. Then came the visitors. They were not invited. They were not coordinated. Fishermen, curious boaters, locals who understood that absence at this scale creates opportunity. Doors that had never been installed could not keep anyone out. Staircases that led nowhere became invitations rather than warning. Vandalism is often framed as malice. In reality, it is usually improvisation. Fireplaces were stripped, fixtures disappeared, decorative stonework cracked under careless hands. Not because people hated the castle, but because unfinished grandeur feels less real, less protected, less deserving of restraint. When a structure stops asserting its purpose, others assign it new ones, and each act of intrusion accelerated the next. The castle's greatest vulnerability was not weather or trespassers, it was indecision. As long as no one claimed authority over its future, every season compounded damage that made future recovery more expensive. This is how large projects die, not in explosions, but in spreadsheets no one opens anymore. What made the situation worse was perception. From afar, the castle still looked expensive, impressive, valuable. That illusion delayed intervention. People assume that things which look wealthy are resilient. They are not. They are often the most fragile, because their systems depend on constant upkeep to justify their scale. By the time officials began to debate what should be done, the cost of action had already doubled, then doubled again. Each year of neglect translated into years of restoration later. The castle had become a lesson in deferred accountability. But here's the more unsettling question. Why did no one step in sooner? Because restoring the castle meant more than fixing walls. It meant confronting the original decision to build it at all. It meant asking whether finishing someone else's emotional project made sense decades later. It meant deciding whether love, once fossilized into stone, could be repurposed without becoming something else entirely. Institutions are uncomfortable with inherited intention, so the castle lingered in bureaucratic limbo, too significant to demolish, too costly to complete, too symbolic to ignore. It existed as a physical argument no one wanted to win. Meanwhile, decay continued doing what it always does, turning complexity into simplicity. Ornate spaces became hazards, decorative flourishes became structural risks, and every collapse, no matter how small, made the idea of restoration feel more naive. At a certain point, the castle stopped being a question of architecture and became a question of narrative. Was it a tragedy worth preserving? A mistake, best erased? Or a warning disguised as a landmark? Because buildings like this don't just reflect the intentions of their creators, they reflect the limits of those intentions. They expose what happens when a single, private motivation is scaled up into something public, permanent, and uncontrollable. And time was still watching, waiting to see whether humans would reclaim the structure, or whether the structure would finish rewriting itself without them. The castle had not collapsed, but it had begun to choose its own ending. And once a structure starts doing that, Reclaiming control becomes far more expensive than anyone expects. Time did not treat the castle as a tragedy. It treated it as inventory. Years passed, and with each one, the structure became easier to misread. What had once been a private decision hardened into a public problem. Ownership on paper still existed, but ownership in practice had evaporated. And when no one actively owns a system, other systems move in to claim it. Nature was first. Vines crept into fractures not meant to exist. Birds nested where chandeliers were supposed to hang. Snow accumulated in rooms that had never been sealed, pressing down on beams designed to carry different kinds of weight. These were not acts of destruction. They were acts of replacement. Nature does not vandalize, it reallocates. But the more consequential pressure came from something less visible. The castle began to attract stories. Locals told versions of it that grew sharper with every retelling. A love so large it broke the man who built it. A house cursed by grief. A monument that punished anyone who tried to finish it. None of this was structurally true, but narratives don't need truth to influence outcomes. They only need repetition. And repetition changes behavior. Potential investors hesitated. Officials delayed decisions. Every rumor added friction to action. The castle wasn't just deteriorating physically, it was becoming conceptually expensive. Touching it meant inheriting its meaning, and meanings are harder to restore than stone. This is the moment when preservation usually fails, because saving a structure like this requires consensus, not admiration, but agreement. Agreement on what the building is now, not what it was supposed to be. And consensus was impossible here because the original intention loomed too large to be ignored, yet too personal to be replicated. What do you do with a monument built for one person when that person is gone? Leaving it untouched felt respectful. Altering it felt invasive. Completing it felt dishonest. Demolishing it felt unforgivable. Every option carried a cost that could not be measured in budgets alone. So the castle remained in suspension. This indecision had consequences. The longer the structure existed in a half-state, the more it trained everyone around it to accept dysfunction as normal. Broken windows became expected. Missing railings became background noise. Risk became familiar. And familiarity is the enemy of urgency. At some point, deterioration stopped shocking anyone. That was the real turning point. Not when damage occurred, but when damage stopped provoking response. Once that threshold is crossed, restoration becomes an abstract idea rather than a goal. Yet paradoxically, the castle's fame grew. Photographs circulated. Writers mentioned it as a curiosity. Tourists pointed from boats, projecting their own meanings onto its silhouette. From afar, it became romantic again. Distance softened the discomfort. The ruin aesthetic took over. But ruins are seductive because they hide the work they demand. What people admired from the river was not stability. It was endurance. And endurance is often mistaken for strength. In reality, the castle was surviving despite neglect, not because of resilience. Its survival was accidental, a byproduct of materials meant for completion, stranded mid-process. That accidental survival created a dangerous illusion. Maybe the castle didn't need intervention after all. But systems don't freeze in time. They only move slower than we expect. Behind the scenes, structural integrity was quietly degrading. Load paths were compromised. Water infiltration weakened supports that no one could easily access anymore. What would have been minor repairs decades earlier now required forensic analysis. The castle had turned from a construction project into a technical puzzle. And puzzles cost money. Eventually, authority intervened, not out of sentiment, but out of liability. An abandoned structure of this size is not neutral. It attracts risk, injury, lawsuits. Responsibility always returns, even if delayed. That intervention marked a shift. The question was no longer whether the castle deserved saving. The question became whether letting it decay further was acceptable. This reframing changed everything. Action was no longer about honoring the past. It was about managing the present. And yet, even then, the original emotional charge of the place refused to disappear. Every plan had to navigate. Every proposal was weighed against a memory that could not be consulted or revised. Restoration would mean reinterpretation, and reinterpretation means admitting that the building's meaning was never fixed to begin with. The castle was no longer asking to be finished as intended. That possibility had expired. It was asking something far more uncomfortable. Could it be allowed to live a second life without pretending the first one hadn't failed? Because saving the structure would require breaking the spell that kept it frozen in grief, and not everyone was ready for that. The hardest part was still ahead. Not repairing stone, but deciding what story the castle was allowed to tell next. And once that decision was made, there would be no way to undo it. Restoration did not begin with scaffolding. It began with an argument, not about money. Money was always going to be required. The real conflict was about authority. Who had the right to decide what the castle was now? Not what it had been meant to be, but what it would be allowed to become. Because restoring an unfinished structure is not an act of repair. It is an act of interpretation. Every choice carried narrative weight. Leaving a wall raw implied reverence for loss. Completing a room implied confidence. The original intention still mattered. Removing elements implied judgment. Doing nothing implied surrender. There was no neutral option. The castle forced everyone involved to take a position, whether they wanted to or not. Engineers approached it like a patient who had survived something improbable. Their reports were cautious. Yes, much of the structure could be stabilized. No, it could not simply be finished. Too many assumptions had expired. Materials had aged out of tolerance. Codes had changed. Techniques once standard were now liabilities. In other words, the castle could be saved, but only if it stopped pretending to be what it was supposed to be. This is where sentiment began to fracture. Some argued that the castle should remain incomplete forever, as a memorial, a visible pause, proof that not all wealth could override mortality. But memorials require maintenance too, and this one was dangerously large. Preserving decay is not cheaper than reversing. It is often more complex. Others pushed for full restoration, not as a residence, but as an experience, a controlled version of completion. But even that raised questions. Which version of complete would be chosen? The one imagined by its original builder? Or one constrained by reality decades later? The truth no one wanted to say out loud was this: the castle could not be restored without rewriting history. Eventually, pragmatism intervened. The structure was too visible to ignore, too unstable to leave alone. Stabilization became the official goal, a word carefully chosen because it promised safety without committing to meaning. Walls would be secured, roofs added where necessary, floors reinforced, not to finish the castle, but to stop it from continuing its uncontrolled transformation. But stabilization has consequences. Once you intervene, you inherit responsibility. Once the building is made safe, it becomes accessible. Once it becomes accessible, it becomes public. And once it becomes public, the story no longer belongs to those who built it or abandoned it. It belongs to those who experienced it. This shift altered the castle's role entirely. It was no longer a private failure frozen in stone. It was becoming a shared artifact, a place people could walk through, project onto, reinterpret again and again. That accessibility softened the original tragedy, but it also diluted it. Visitors did not feel the weight of halted labor or unanswered orders. They felt curiosity, wonder, melancholy, perhaps, but controlled, consumable melancholy. The kind that fits into an afternoon visit. And that raised an uncomfortable realization. Preservation does not preserve meaning. It redistributes it. The castle's grief, once absolute, became optional. Some rooms were restored to suggestion rather than completion. Furniture was placed not as it had been, but as it might have been. This distinction mattered. The castle was no longer presenting a truth. It was offering a version, a guided narrative with edges smoothed just enough to be digestible. This was not deception. It was translation. Because raw history is often unusable, it repels rather than invites. To survive, the castle had to compromise with its audience. It had to exchange ambiguity for access. But something was lost in that exchange. The structure stopped resisting interpretation. Where once it had been an unresolved question, it now provided answer, or at least the illusion of. Visitors left believing they understood it. That belief was the price of its survival. And still, the original cost remained embedded. Restoration budgets grew. Each repaired section revealed another vulnerability. Each improvement exposed a flaw elsewhere. Saving the castle was not a single expense. It was a permanent commitment, one that would never fully pay itself back. This is the paradox of preservation. Once you save something, you agree to keep saving. The castle no longer drained one man's fortune. It now drew from collective resources, taxes, ticket sales, public attention. The cost had shifted from private obsession to shared obligation. In that sense, the castle finally became what it had always threatened to be, larger than any individual. It survived not because the original dream was honored, but because it was absorbed into a system capable of sustaining it. The very thing that once made it dangerous, its scale, was now the reason it could endure. But endurance is not resolution. The castle stands today neither finished nor abandoned, neither sacred nor empty. It occupies a middle ground that feels stable only because constant effort holds it there. Remove that effort, and the old forces return immediately, which leads to a final, unsettling thought. If the castle now exists only through ongoing intervention, was the original mistake ever corrected, or merely extended across generations? Because some structures do not end when construction stops. They end when we stop agreeing to carry them forward. What changed the castle most was not restoration, it was normalization. Once visitors began arriving regularly, the structure entered a new phase of existence, one far quieter than abandonment and far more permanent. Paths were defined, schedules were posted, rules were written. The castle was no longer a question mark on the river, it was an attraction with hours of operation. That shift carried consequences no one had fully anticipated. When something becomes routine, it stops feeling fragile. Staff unlock doors each morning assuming the walls will still be standing. Visitors climb staircases, trusting that someone else has verified their safety. Over time, the extraordinary becomes background, and background objects are easy to take for granted. The castle's story was increasingly reduced to a single sentence, repeated until it lost its sharp edges. A grand gesture of love, interrupted by loss. Simple, contained, safe. But simplicity is not accuracy, it is compression. And compression hides strain. Behind the scenes, the structure still demanded constant negotiation. Climate control fought moisture that the original design had never sealed out. Structural monitoring tracked movements too small to feel, but too important to ignore. Every winter introduced new stresses. Every summer, new expansion. The building was alive in the way aging systems are alive, quietly, expensively, without pause. What had once been an emotional project had become an operational one, and operations required justification. Ticket sales helped, but they did not cover everything. They never do. The castle survived through layered support, public funding, institutional backing, and a steady flow of attention. Attention, in this context, was a currency. As long as people cared, resources followed. As soon as they didn't, the math would change. This dependency on interest created a subtle pressure. The story had to remain compelling. Too much tragedy repels. Too much romance trivializes. The narrative had to stay balanced, emotionally resonant but not uncomfortable. Over time, this balance reshaped how the castle was presented. Interpretive materials softened uncertainty. Guided tours answered questions that had once been left open. Ambiguity was bad for flow, but ambiguity had been the castle's most honest feature. The more the story was streamlined, the more the original tension dissolved. Visitors left with closure, even though the building itself had never truly received it. That mismatch mattered. It turned an unresolved structure into a resolved experience. And that raises a difficult question. Does a place lose something when its discomfort is curated away? The castle still stood unfinished in technical terms, but emotionally, it had been completed for public consumption. The open-endedness that once made it unsettling was now framed as charm. This reframing did not erase the past. it refracted it. For some, the castle became proof that love could outlast loss. For others, it became a warning about excess. For many, it became simply a backdrop for photographs. None of these interpretations were wrong, but none were complete either. The system that sustained the castle had succeeded in one sense. It made the structure stable, but stability came at the cost of tension. The building no longer pressed questions onto those who encountered it. It offered answers instead, and answers, unlike questions, eventually grow stale. The irony is that the castle's survival now depends on a future it cannot control. Cultural relevance shifts, travel patterns change, public priorities evolve. What feels essential in one generation becomes optional in the next. The castle is prepared for weather. It is not prepared for indifference. Every preserved structure carries this risk, not collapse, but fading, becoming known without being understood, maintained without being examined, loved without being challenged. And that brings us back to the original mistake. Not the decision to build, not even the decision to stop. The mistake was assuming that intention could be frozen in stone and remain legible forever. What the castle demonstrates instead is something far less comforting. Once a structure outgrows its moment, it must constantly renegotiate its relevance. If it stops doing that, it doesn't fail dramatically. It simply becomes quieter, still standing, still intact, but increasingly hollow. The castle has survived loss, abandonment, decay, and reinterpretation. What it has not yet survived is irrelevant. That threat is slower than weather, and harder to see than structural cracks. But it is relentless. Because when attention moves on, support follows. And when support fades, even the most carefully preserved structures begin to slide back toward the state they were rescued from. Not all at once. At first, just in small ways. And by the time anyone notices, the question will return, more urgent than ever. How long are we willing to keep paying for a story that no longer unsettles us? The castle's greatest illusion is that it has already survived its hardest test. Weather was predictable, decay was measurable, even abandonment followed known patterns. But what the castle faces now is subtler and far more unstable, reinterpretation over time. Not by experts or caretakers, but by generations who inherit the structure without inheriting the urgency that once surrounded it. Every preserved place eventually reaches this stage. At first, caretakers are motivated by rescue, then by pride, later by habit, and finally by procedure. By the time a structure reaches that last phase, no one involved remembers what it felt like when failure was still possible. The systems remain, but the emotional memory that created them has dissolved. The castle now operates in that final phase. Maintenance schedules exist because they always have. Funding requests are renewed because denying them would feel irresponsible. The structure persists, not because it demands attention, but because withdrawing attention would require a conscious decision, and conscious decisions are harder than passive continuation. This is how long-term commitments quietly trap institutions. No one wants to be the generation that lets it go, yet each generation feels less connected to the original stakes. The story becomes thinner with each retelling, until what remains is an outline rather than a wound. Love, loss, abandonment, restoration, survival. The sequence is familiar, predictable, comfortable. But comfort is dangerous for systems built on exception. The castle was never meant to be ordinary. Its scale, its interruption, its persistence, all of it defied normal pattern. Turning it into something routine strips away the very tension that once justified extraordinary effort. And once that tension disappears, the math changes. Budgets tighten, priorities shift. New preservation projects compete for limited resources. The castle is no longer the urgent patient. It is the stable one. Stable systems are always the first to be tested when cuts come. This is where the future becomes fragile, not because the walls are weak, but because justification is. When support erodes, it does not announce itself. It begins with postponed upgrades, deferred studies, temporary fixes that quietly become permanent. The castle has already experienced this once, during abandonment. The difference now is that the decline would be bureaucratic, not visible from the river. And bureaucratic decline is harder to reverse than physical damage. There is also the matter of expectation. Visitors arrive expecting meaning, closure, a story that fits into an afternoon. If the castle fails to deliver that, if it becomes confusing, uncomfortable, or demanding, interest wanes. And interest, as always, is currency. This creates pressure to simplify further. But simplification is not preservation. It is erosion, disguised as accessibility. The more the castle explains itself, the less it invites reflection. The more it answers questions, the fewer it provokes. Eventually, it risks becoming decorative, a setting rather than a subject. That would be the most complete transformation of all, because the castle began as a structure overloaded with intention. Every stone carried expectation. Every corridor assumed permanence. If it ends as a backdrop, the reversal will be total. And yet, there is no clear alternative. Reintroducing discomfort risks alienating visitors. Reducing access undermines funding. Leaving questions unanswered frustrates those who want certainty. Every path forward contains a trade-off that chips away at something else. This is the hidden cost that never appears on restoration plans. Meaning is finite. Once consumed, it cannot be replenished. The castle's caretakers are not villains in this process. They are managing an inheritance with no expiration date and no clear success condition. The castle can never be declared saved in a final sense. It can only be maintained until consensus fails. That failure may come suddenly, or it may arrive invisibly through gradual disengagement. And when it does, the castle will not announce it with collapsing towers or dramatic ruin. It will announce it with silence, fewer visitors, smaller budgets, less urgency, until one day intervention is again discussed not as preservation, but as necessity. The cycle will restart. This raises a final, deeply uncomfortable question. Was the castle ever meant to be resolved, or was its true legacy always this? An unfinished obligation passed forward, demanding care without offering closure, a structure that survives only as long as people agree that its unresolved nature still matters. Because if that agreement disappears, the castle will not fight back. It will simply wait, just as it did before. The castle still stands, and that fact alone convinces many that the story has ended. But structures like this don't end. They transition. What looks like permanence is actually a balance constantly renegotiated between attention and neglect. The walls endure not because they are resolved, but because, so far, enough people have agreed that unresolved things deserve care. That agreement is fragile. Every generation that inherits the castle inherits a question it did not ask. Why keep this? Why now? Why at this cost? At first, the answers feel obvious. History, beauty, legacy. But over time, those words thin out. They become placeholders rather than explanations. And when explanations weaken, justification must work harder. The castle's greatest risk is no longer collapse. It is becoming too easy to explain. Once a place fits neatly into a sentence, it loses its ability to resist being dismissed. Once it becomes predictable, it stops demanding engagement. The original interruption, the halted construction, the silence, the abandonment, was what gave the structure its gravity. Remove that gravity, and the castle becomes interchangeable. This is the quiet danger of successful preservation. When done too well, it erases the evidence of struggle that made the object worth saving in the first place. What remains is form without friction. The castle did not teach its visitors how fragile intention can be when scaled into stone. It taught them that everything eventually works out. That loss can be contained. That unfinished things can be safely displayed behind railings and schedule. That lesson is comforting and misleading, because the true story of the castle is not about love or tragedy. It is about commitment extended beyond its natural lifespan, about decisions made for reasons that no longer exist, maintained by systems that did not create them, justified by narratives that grow simpler as the cost grows heavier. The castle asks something very specific of the future, not admiration, but participation. It requires people to keep agreeing that it matters, even when it no longer unsettles them, even when newer structures demand attention, even when the emotional connection fades into abstraction. That is a harder task than building walls. In this sense, the castle never stopped being unfinished. Construction ended, restoration intervened, normalization followed, but completion was never possible. Completion would have required alignment between intention, use, and meaning. That alignment never returned. And perhaps that is the point. The castle functions today as a reminder not of love, but of scale, of what happens when private emotion is translated into permanent infrastructure, of how systems outlive their reason, and how responsibility stretches across time until no one remembers where it began. The building still absorbs resources, still demands care, still shapes decisions around it. The bill did not stop in 1904. It was simply redistributed. The stone did not forget. Every season, the structure proves the same quiet truth. Stopping a project does not undo it. It only changes who carries it next. The castle remains, not as a monument to a man or a marriage, but as evidence of something more uncomfortable, that some gestures are too large to ever be resolved, only managed. It stands because people continue to choose standing over letting go. And one day, that choice will be tested again, not by weather, not by decay, but by indifference. When that moment comes, the castle will not plead its case. It never has. It will simply wait, just as it did when the tools were set down and the river kept moving. The house is still there. The name is still remembered, but the cost never stopped accumulating.